a popular Irish air rewritten in the style of 5 unnamed 1820s composers, such as the Brilliant One, the Sensible One, and the Original One. In the grand finale, all 5 of them battle for control of the keyboard, interrupting each other mid-phrase. This is a musical puzzle from 1825. The English pianist-composer Cipriani Potter wrote these variations in the style of 5 eminent artists, which the player had to figure out using clues in the score. He titled it the Enigma, 3/4 of a century before Elgar's famous and unrelated variations of the same name. Perhaps an 1825 listener would immediately recognize these caricatures, but 200 years later, it's a much more difficult game for us to play. Since Potter never publicly revealed the solutions, all we can do is piece together the puzzle from surviving evidence. Hints in the score, comparable variations in fantasies from the era, and contemporary reviewers who tried to guess the solutions to Potter's enigmas. That's what I'll use to break down this score page by page to see if we can solve these enigmas in the 21st century. But if you want to guess the 5 composers first without any spoilers, then skip ahead to my full recording at the end of this video, and good luck to you. Heads up, there is an antidote to the cheap, scammy merchandise online. Amadeus Apparel's classical-inspired shirts are designed by actual musicians using real music excerpts, quality prints, and materials that hold up wear after wear. You can get yours for 10% off with my link in the description or promo code PianoCurio at AmadeusApparel.com. The Irish theme Potter used for his Enigma variations was a well-known traditional jig tune called Paddywhack. The same tune appeared as While History's Muse in Volume 6 of a popular anthology by Thomas Moore, Irish Melodies, with lyrics describing the enshrining of the Dublin-born Duke of Wellington's name into the annals of history, when his victories against Napoleon were still fresh. Now let's narrow down who eminent artists could have been referring to. Since this work appeared in London and was by an English composer, we should home in on composers and performers who would have been most familiar in the British Isles. Beethoven was one of the most famous composers alive anywhere, and Rossini operas were all the rage in London just as they were across the continent. Eminent composers outside of London included Cherubini, Spohr, Weber, Reiche, Schubert, Czerny, Hummel, and Kuhlau. Mendelssohn was just 16 years old in 1825 and wouldn't make his London debut until 1829. Paganini would follow in 1831, so it's too early for both of those. Likewise, the later Paris-based pianists Chopin and Thalberg would not rise to international fame until the 1830s. The 13-year-old prodigy Liszt appeared in London in 1824 and again in 1825, but didn't have a mature style for Potter to caricature, so he's probably out as well. In the 1810s and 20s, though, London was a hotspot for distinguished pianist composers. Clementi, Kramer, Kalkbrenner, Ries, and Moscheles all spent significant time living, playing, and publishing piano music in and around London. They were obliged to spin variations on popular tunes that their audiences recognized and would purchase copies of at the store. Ignaz Moscheles reported a huge success in Liverpool in November 1825 after playing fantasies on Rule Britannia and an Irish air. 2 months later, he visited Dublin, where members of the Irish nobility were in raptures over his fantasy on Irish melodies. Likewise, Kalkbrenner's variations and fantasies from this period show a preoccupation with English Scottish, Welsh, and Irish tunes, as do the works of Ries and Kramer. But even pianists outside of London were keen on setting such tunes to variations and potpourris as Beethoven did for Rule Britannia and God Save the King. Czerny, Hummel, and Kuhlau, among others, also contributed virtuosic piano pieces on these types of international airs. In short, a London listener in 1825 would have been used to comparing how different pianists varied the same familiar themes, and that was the concept behind Potter's musical guessing game. And who was Cipriani Potter? Little Chip, as his friends called him due to his short stature, was a London native composer and elected member of the Philharmonic Society, a driving force behind the city's instrumental concerts. He spent about 8 months studying in Vienna, where he met and received some advice from Beethoven, who deemed him a good fellow with a talent for composition. Upon returning to England in 1819, Potter was active as a piano soloist and gave the English premieres of several Mozart and Beethoven concertos. Overall, Potter was a well-connected musician with an intimate knowledge of London concert life, and as a pianist himself, he was a keen observer of his colleagues. The first critic to take a stab at guessing Potter's enigmas was at a loss. Not having the penetrating talent of an Oedipus, he wrote, "We have in vain essayed to solve this enigma." This was a more conservative critic who sensed that Potter was making fun of what he called the modern crudities and impossibilities of composers like Hummel and Czerny, and he hoped that the variations would expose these glaring absurdities once and for all. Another reviewer in December 1825 was much more optimistic and insightful. He heard the introduction from bar 9 onwards as a clear reference to Moscheles, whose playing often displayed these chromatic, toccata-like textures with 16ths against 8th notes. The reviewer also points out his likeness in the leaping octaves in the left hand, and you can see the way he would pass off 16ths between the right and left hands before returning to the theme, which seems to be what Potter is imitating here. After the Irish theme, we meet mystery musician number 2 in the first variation. Our eyes are naturally drawn to these florid right-hand figurations over an arpeggiated chord. Is this an imitation of the Dublin-born pianist John Field, inventor of the nocturne and the natural pairing with an Irish theme? Or maybe it could be Hummel, famous for his also very highly ornate style. In fact, our critic takes this as an excellent imitation of Ferdinand Ries. As evidence, he cites the notes of different value, the sudden crash after the first section, the wrist passages, and frequent arpeggios. Of course, some of this language was shared among Field, Hummel, Moscheles, and others, but a good impression is always about picking out someone's tick, what they fall back on constantly. And Potter was homing in on these swirling right-hand figures, the capricious rhythmic values, and the rolled chords across 2 hands. The last of these do show up quite a bit in the cadenzas of Ries, and I don't see them as much in Hummel or much at all in Field. We don't know the definite answer, but given that Ries lived in London for 11 years and how confident the 1825 reviewer was in identifying him, I'm willing to trust his contemporary judgment that this is Ries, while leaving the door open to Hummel, who was doing a lot of this stuff as early as 1805 in his Opus 18 Fantasy. As for Field, it's telling that neither reviewer mentioned his name, and these chord passages seem too grandiose for his relatively lean style. Variation 2 is subtitled The Brilliant, and the reviewer immediately identifies Kalkbrenner, though I could also see an argument for Czerny. The reviewer writes that the regularity of passages, the imitations, and the cadenza are all good mimics of Kalkbrenner, though he says it seems to be a shallow imitation with little for the left hand to do. The cadenza is this really funny moment going up and down the keyboard with gratuitous flourishes and that cliché rushed chord passage to stir up the tension. It's a great caricature of a flashy 1820s virtuoso. You can see a lot of resemblances in Kalkbrenner's scores for variations and fantasies, the brilliant runs, the symmetrical passages shared between the hands, and tellingly, the cadenza inserted into the middle of a variation. Czerny certainly also contributed to this flashy, brilliant style in the 1820s, but again, if we trust the reviewer's contemporary ears and consider that, like Ries, Kalkbrenner lived for quite a long time in London, I think the evidence does lean towards him. Variation number 3, The Sensible, is evidently Mr. Kramer, our reviewer writes. Kramer was known for a delicacy and smoothness in his playing. No harsh effects, legato passage work. Notice these arpeggios all over the place, even on just 2 notes. You find that gesture a lot in his music, as well as the acciaccatoras spiced in and the skipping dotted rhythms. Moscheles compared Kramer's compositions to Mozart and said that his thin fingers glided imperceptibly along the keys, that he made the lines sing, but that he resented his often frivolous embellishments. We can see some of those embellishments scattered throughout here. Moscheles also told a funny story about seeing the aging Kramer play a piano duet in 1833 with the fiery younger virtuoso Henri Hertz. Whereas Hertz played like a young, frisky colt, Kramer was more like a well-fed, cream-colored state horse, harnessed on great occasions to the royal carriage. So Kramer was a well-respected player, but old school and tame compared to other 1820s virtuosos, at least by that time, which makes Potter's subtitle, The Sensible, very fitting here. Variation 4 is the odd one out. It doesn't seem to be imitating a pianist at all. There is no Italian popular composer for the instrument, the reviewer wrote, yet All'Italiana is its title, and no one but Rossini is presented to our idea. Apparently, the reviewer never considered the Italian-born Muzio Clementi as an option, since he had been in England for most of his life. The embellishments and the forte passages and thirds do resemble a slow, operatic air more than a Clementi sonata, but the writer points out that the idea of Rossini varying an Irish air is a musical bull, or a laughable contradiction. Rossini arrived for a several-month stay in London in late 1823, so his celebrated visit was still fresh when Potter's variations appeared. Contemporary piano fantasies of Rossini's operas bear resemblance to many of the features here, like the chunky triad accompaniments, the characteristic passages and thirds, and the short bursts of vocal ornamentation. Potter certainly could have gone further to convince us it's Rossini. The embellishments are a little light compared to other fantasies on Rossini's operas, but if this is Rossini, this will not be the last time we see him. Variation 5 is titled Originale. The reviewer first thought of Beethoven, but the repeated notes were a giveaway for Moscheles. Just a few years earlier, the Parisian piano manufacturer Erard patented the double escapement action for piano, allowing for faster note repetition. And when Moscheles visited his factory in the early 1820s, he correctly predicted that this would revolutionize piano playing. The reviewer here seems to acknowledge Moscheles as an early adopter of this technique, and it shows in his music. He notes that they're introduced somewhat randomly in the middle of the variation, and this is a general consequence of the work's collage-like nature. Other hints include this passage with the left hand tremolos and octaves in the right hand, which resembles one in Moscheles' heroic fantasy, as well as the chromatic passages and generally the diversity of techniques, flying all over the keyboard. For comparison, consider these 2 pages from his second concerto. You have chromaticism, leaps, repeated notes, thirds and octaves, alternating chords. It's no wonder he was considered one of the most spectacular soloists of his day. Another of his signature moves was the leaping passage in tenths, seen here at the end of his second concerto, and also throughout this variation. The reviewer agrees that Moscheles was one of the most original and powerful performers of that time, so this one seems to safely be an imitation of him. Perhaps the best and certainly the strangest part of the whole work is the grand finale, where all 5 composers appear in one big fantasy, creating lots of funny moments of contrast that sound like nonsense if you don't know what's going on. Notice the dead ends littered all over the place. Often this is Potter cutting to another composer who suddenly fights for control over the keyboard. But I think it's also poking fun at improvisations and cadenzas when the pianist would constantly shift to new ideas without completing the previous ones. There are several unresolved cadences and non sequiturs that just make this a wild ride. The first variation artist, whether it be Ries, Hummel, or Field, begins with a nocturne followed by those wrist passages in octaves, as the reviewer called them. Then there's a clear change of style into what sounds like Kramer, maybe almost like a major key version of Mozart's D minor piano concerto. points out that this passage resembles Kramer's favorite technique of a long trill with the theme underneath, as well as the intermittent rests and arpeggios which we saw earlier in Variation 3. Rossini appears to take over at the Allegretto scherzando with some characteristic triplets in thirds. This section unfolds like the orchestral interlude of an Italian opera, the staccato articulation, the march rhythm, the simple tonic dominant phrases, and the orchestral tremolo effect, with the Irish theme stomped out in the left hand. At the Allegro con fuoco, Kalkbrenner bursts in and strikes up a quasi-fugal imitation of the theme, which the reviewer says was a favorite maneuver of his. Next, Moschles returns in the Allegro molto with another toccata, growing in speed and volume through the next page. The reviewer questions the faithfulness of the final presto as a copy of Moschles, though we might compare it to a strikingly similar passage at the end of his fourth concerto. There is no official solution to these enigmas. If you hear references to someone else, I'd love to read your case for it in the comments. But no matter what the answers may be, these variations teach us something. Perhaps they don't make for a great piano work like Beethoven's variations, they're not profoundly moving like Elgar's Enigma variations, but Potter's work does conjure some vivid caricatures, a collage of pianistic mannerisms designed for listeners who had personally heard these artists play or attended their operas. So I think we should forgive the music's patchy qualities in light of what it can show us about how 1820s performers were perceived as individuals, what their favorite techniques were, and the sheer variety of their approaches to the keyboard. This was an era of radical change and advancement in pianism before the Romantic generation, and Potter's Enigma variations illuminate a slice of that culture, all inside the irresistible concept of a puzzle. So if you want to immerse yourself in a 200-year-old cultural moment in all its frivolities, then this long-forgotten score is certainly worth your time.